Well, hello everyone. Hello Rob and Beth who joined me today. It says here the football reporters mandated banter. So who would like to give me some mandated banter? Rob, you're always good
I'll
for
go.
banter.
There's going to be a fantastically positive pod because there's no Mark Ogden to bring us all down with these negative views about everything. So I'm expecting positivity all the way through.
That is true, Beth. You are covering a team that is almost certain to win the league, and you're not Mark Ogden. So, everyone's working for you.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's a lot of pressure to bring the positivity, but, the sun's shining, so fingers crossed it can be a nice positive pod.
Well, let's start with Liverpool. It's that time of the season where there are plenty of contracts being decided up and down the land. We'll get to De Bruyne later, but first, Liverpool announced a 2-year extension for Mo Salah on Friday. Beth, it's the end of yet another long-running Mohamed Salah contract saga, but I guess there was no real surprise in the end that this worked out the way it did.
Yeah, it's felt like most of the season, to be honest, that there's been an expectation in and around the club that Mohamed Salah would commit to a new deal. But then, obviously, the longer it goes on and, there's external speculation, obviously Saudi Arabia have been very interested in him for a number of years now. So until it was done, you always were sort of slightly reluctant to say it was going to happen. But yeah, it ultimately it was. I was down at the training ground for Slot's press conference last Friday, and it just felt like the whole place had been given a little bit of a lift, really, by that news. Players, manager, fans. I think it sounds cliche to say it's like a new signing, but I think keeping Mo Salah for another 2 years is as good as signing a £50 million new player, because the sort of form that he's been in this season, he's almost a guarantee of goals. And I suppose the risk of giving players above the age of 30 long contracts or new contracts is that their form might tail off, and of course that might prove to be the case for Mo Salah over the next 2 years. But he is someone who keeps himself in peak physical condition. He's shown no signs of dropping off this season, certainly, and I think his numbers are so good that he could afford to have a little bit of a drop-off and still probably be getting you 20 goals a season, which, I'm sure Rob, covering Manchester United, will know it's not easy to get strikers that can come in and produce those numbers. So, so great news for Liverpool. And I think, against West Ham, you could sort of see in that first half in particular, he just sort of seemed buoyed by the news being out and that sort of weight being off his shoulders. I'm sure it'll be nice for him not to have to field questions on his contract every week now. For everyone involved with Liverpool, it was a big day and a big moment in the season.
So what changed, Beth? Because obviously he was giving the noises, and I know he's a bit of a master manipulator when it comes to sort of suggesting he's more out than in, and he's maybe trying to drive up his wage offerings and contract lengths and whatever. I mean, he wouldn't have gone into this wanting 2 years, right? He would have wanted longer than 2 years. So what changed? Did he compromise? Did Liverpool end up giving him more money? What was the sort of catalyst for finding the agreement?
Well, I think the club, ultimately, they've dealt with this as they have with this contract situations of Virgil van Dijk and Trent Alexander-Arnold, sort of shrouded in secrecy, really. But sort of from speaking to various people at the club over the last couple of weeks, because there have been some reports that Salah had taken a pay cut. I've been told that was never on the agenda, and that pretty much from the beginning of negotiations, despite the noises that Salah might have made to the TV cameras and things, that both his camp and Liverpool were fairly confident that they were going to reach an agreement eventually. So, some of those noises coming out from Salah earlier in the year, maybe that was just a little bit of gameplay, and maybe it was sort of forcing the club's hand a little bit. I think maybe in an ideal world he might have wanted longer than 2 years. I think ultimately, he is in a different position, as is Virgil van Dijk to Trent Alexander-Arnold, whereby, Real Madrid obviously massively interested in Alexander-Arnold and a clear avenue for him to follow. I suppose for Van Dijk and Salah, the fact that they are a little bit older maybe gives the club a stronger negotiating hand, because for Salah, really, it was probably Saudi or Liverpool, and ultimately he's decided he wants to stay and compete at the highest level. I think maybe when those first noises came out from him back in November, I think he didn't maybe feel like the club were being as proactive as they could have been in terms of approaching him and really being aggressive, trying to commit into a new deal. But from what I've heard, mostly the negotiations, that they've always felt like there was going to be an agreement reached.
Rob, what do you think? this sends out as a message to the rest of the Premier League that Salah's staying for another 2 years in a team that is, virtually certain now to win the league?
Well, it's massive. I think that if he had left, you severely weaken Liverpool. I mean, the cost to replace someone like that, who is such a regular goal scorer, would run into the hundreds of millions, and it's debatable whether Liverpool have got that money to spend. I think it's been difficult for Liverpool, having three massive contracts all coming up at the same time, and you can make the argument. It obviously looks like Trent is going to go to Real Madrid, and you can make the argument that they've made a mistake there because obviously Salah and Van Dijk are beyond the age of 30, so coming to the end of their careers, where Trent in theory is at the peak of his powers. Well, actually, Trent is a right back, and they've already got Conor Bradley there. Right backs don't cost as much as centre halves and strikers. I actually think when the rest of the Premier League, look at Liverpool's squad in the summer, the one that Liverpool probably could afford to lose is Trent. They probably couldn't afford to lose Van Dijk and Mo Salah. And Liverpool will obviously go on and win the league. And when the predictions come out for what's going to happen next year, I think most people are going to pick Liverpool to win the league because they've done it this year. They've kept their two star men in Van Dijk, or it certainly looks like they're going to keep Van Dijk, and they are going to keep Salah, and they're going to strengthen again in the summer. And that just shows you how important it is. I think that if Salah had gone, there would have been a kind of a gap there maybe for an Arsenal or a Man City to kind of claw the way back into that conversation. Obviously, there still is. You can't hand out titles for next year already. I just think it's a little bit perhaps demoralising for the rest. I mean, you just look at the way that Pep Guardiola answered the question about Mo Salah's contract on Friday. You could tell in his kind of body language and the way he answered it, it's just a little bit like, ugh. He would never admit it, but his job at Man City would be immeasurably easier if Mo Salah's not in that Liverpool team, and that says everything about how important he is to Liverpool.
Beth, Rob mentioned there about it being potentially a big summer for Liverpool. You spoke to Virgil van Dijk after the game on Sunday, and he said it was going to be just that. I mean, how did you interpret those quotes?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because Virgil van Dijk isn't the first person connected with the club to sort of hint that it will be a big summer. Arne Slot has spoken. He spoke a couple of months ago, I think, to the BBC, and he said that it had been obviously a quiet summer window last summer. They brought in Mamardashvili, but he obviously stayed on loan at Valencia. They brought in Federico Chiesa, who has been, he's made just a handful of appearances. So essentially, Slot has been working with Klopp's team basically, and he made a point of saying, we wanted to highlight targets for the summer, and we've done that. And yeah, Virgil van Dijk yesterday seemed pretty bullish almost in his insistence that this will be a big summer for Liverpool. And you would imagine that has maybe played a factor in him wanting to stick around, in Mo Salah wanting to stick around. Salah was quite adamant in his quotes when his contract was announced that he feels Liverpool can be competing for the biggest titles, not just this season, but for years to come. And otherwise he wouldn't have committed his future there. And so you would like to think that they maybe have assurances from the club that they are going to be proactive in the transfer market. They've had a quiet few windows now. And I do think, Rob mentioned sort of City and Arsenal clawing the way back. I certainly think next season, both of those teams will be stronger, and Liverpool can't afford to sort of rest on their laurels. There's a couple of areas of really clear improvement needed in the squad. They need a left back, absolutely, and they probably need a number 9. You would think Darwin Núñez is probably going to be on his way out this summer, so there's probably still 3 or 4 players I think who could come in and make this team and this squad better, which is I guess maybe a little bit of a worry for the rest of the Premier League, because I still think this team has levels to go under Slot, but also it depends very much on whether they get that recruitment right this summer.
Now, we are recording this early in the week, and Virgil van Dijk has dropped a pretty strong hint that he's likely to reveal his next move. So are we looking at, of the two left, Trent and Van Dijk, one staying and one going? What's the latest on both of them, please?
Yeah, so that has been the general consensus for a little while now, I think. I think the sort of the silence around Trent Alexander-Arnold is probably pretty deafening, as people have spoken to at the club over the past few weeks have been insistent that even when sort of those reports came out from Spain that essentially a deal had been done, there's been nothing tangible as of yet that Liverpool can comment on. When there is, I'm sure they'll be in a position to say that exactly what's happening. But certainly all of the noise does seem to indicate that Trent will be leaving unless there is a drastic U-turn over the next few weeks. Virgil van Dijk, as good as said really yesterday that he is staying. He was quite coy. He obviously wouldn't answer it directly, but it's all signs now pointing to him signing a 2-year contract at Liverpool, which is massive. He's not just incredibly important as a footballer, but I think as a leader and the way that he commands. He has this presence about him on the pitch, I think is so important. I think he's probably, Arne Slot's most important player. He's someone who he looks to. I think he's been incredibly useful in terms of almost plugging a little bit of that void that's been left by Klopp in terms of his sort of leadership and his charisma. I think Van Dijk has almost stepped up to the plate and helped Slot with that a little bit. So I think his importance is massive to Liverpool and a real coup to get him to stay for another 2 years.
Well, it takes a brave man to cross the North London divide, as Sol Campbell found out when he made the switch from Spurs to Arsenal. Vinai Venkatesham is the latest to do it, James. Obviously, a former Arsenal CEO who's going to take up the same job at Spurs at the end of the season. I mean, firstly, is that quite a big surprise for the London reporters? And what do we know about him?
Yeah, I think it is a surprise. I mean, he left Arsenal on good terms, and I know that in the intervening period, he's had offers from other clubs and he's turned them down. He was recently appointed to the new Wembley Stadium Advisory Group. That was sort of, I think, spoke to his skill set really that became quite effective during his 14 years at Arsenal. And he held I think 6 different roles in that time. But he probably made the biggest impact in terms of the sort of commercial side of things, sponsorship agreements, and that was kind of part of his life before he got into football. And I think that's obviously an area that Spurs will look to exploit when he comes in the summer. But as you say, there are not many players who make that cross that divide. Certainly not many executives either. And he sort of kept his options open for quite some time. Very highly regarded within the game. But yeah, He's often sort of spoken privately about how he's able to keep a relatively low profile when he was at Arsenal, even though he had obviously a very prominent position. He could travel on the train to games and he wouldn't often get bothered and that sort of stuff. I suspect he might not be doing that for the first few weeks when he's going into North London on the other side.
I mean, just in terms of what he achieved at Arsenal, obviously we've seen that on the pitch, Arsenal have kind of turned themselves around under Mikel Arteta, and Arteta himself has got a lot of credit for that. But just how important has Venkatesham been, or how important was he to that transformation? Because obviously it's one thing doing it on the pitch, but it all starts, doesn't it, from how you're organised off the field? Yeah,
I think he's the glue that binds it all together, really. If you think about it, there's various sort of examples of this. He was very important in developing the women's team. And he asked people to implement sort of an external company to come in and essentially overhaul the way that the Arsenal women's team was structured, the operational side of it, hiring extra medical staff, support staff. And he had the aspiration of the women's team playing all of their games at Emirates Stadium. And obviously that's something that they play regularly there now. And they're one of the most successful women's teams around. And, so he's had that impact. But also on the men's side, he was very sort of central to how their club hierarchy sort of grew organically and successfully. And to sort of explain that, he, as I say, he held 6 different positions in his 14 years. He ended up being chief executive at the end. But what grew around him was obviously Arsene Wenger left the club, autonomous figure. Unai Emery came in as head coach, had that kind of remit stripped back from manager to head coach. Then Arteta succeeded Emery, and it kind of grew back towards being sort of an old school manager, really, if you like, with far-reaching powers straight into the board. And alongside that, they appointed their first ever sporting director in 2019 in Edu, and Vinai Venkatesham appointed both of those men. And how that kind of grew over time, where Arteta grew in confidence, grew in authority, and Edu grew into that role as well, and the club really felt their way into that structure, it was a very atypical setup. So Vinai would sit at the top of it, and then Arteta would report into him directly, and Edu would also report into him directly. And And it doesn't normally work like that at clubs. It would go manager or head coach into sporting director into chief executive. But he had that kind of collaborative approach, and he's a very intelligent, very thoughtful, very genial guy who was able to sort of mould all that together and sort of manage the different voices, manage the egos, if you like, to some extent, and really create a culture of progress at that club that allowed Arteta to thrive and grow, and obviously in his first managerial role become what he's been in the last 2 years, which is the main sort of challenger to Pep Guardiola until obviously Arne Slot came in at Liverpool. And then also to facilitate the growth in the women's game and the operational things at London Colney.
Beth, just going to come to you. I mean, obviously, hiring a new CEO doesn't get the heart racing, perhaps as a new centre forward or central midfielder. But obviously, covering Liverpool, you probably know better than anyone how important it is for clubs to get it right off the field. And Liverpool have had a little bit of a reshuffle, haven't they, recently? And obviously been fantastic on the field. But how important was, or the setup of Liverpool, how important has that been to how they've been able to see some success under Arne Slot this season?
Yeah, I think Liverpool's sort of setup behind the scenes was fundamental to the success under Jurgen Klopp, and I actually think when there was sort of a dissolution, I guess, of that really rigid structure, that's when things started to go a little bit awry for Liverpool in terms of recruitment. Michael Edwards, who has been sort of revered, he was sporting director at Liverpool. He now works a different role for FSG, but he left the club. His successor, Julian Ward, left the club, and it left Liverpool in a position where in the summer of 2023, they had an interim sporting director in Jörg Schmadtke, and that is probably the summer where the three out of contract players, obviously we now know that Mohamed Salah resigned, we think Van Dijk will as well, but that sort of vacuum of power, I guess, was allowed to happen. Which I think just shows you how fundamental it is that you do have those structures in place at these big clubs. And that was something very much that FSG tried to do last season. When Jurgen Klopp announced that he was leaving, it was very much about getting a sporting director in Richard Hughes, and it was then his job to find Klopp's successor, which he did in Arne Slot. And Michael Edwards has come back, as I said, to FSG. So I think Liverpool now are reverting to the roots, I guess, in a way, in bringing in those figures behind the scenes. So yeah, I think for Tottenham it's going to be key. And as James said earlier on, I think Vinai's work with the women's team at Arsenal has been sort of transformational for the club. And I think Tottenham are in a position now where the women's team probably isn't the priority when you look at how the men's team is doing, but certainly it's an asset to the club and an aspect that could be elevated, I guess. And I think that's something that, for Tottenham fans and Tottenham women's fans, that could be quite exciting going forward.
James, are we expecting this to be one big change in a summer of change at Spurs? Obviously, the pressure is growing on Ange after a miserable season domestically, obviously still in the Europa League. But is it looking like there's going to be a change of manager to come with a change of CEO?
Well, the issue that's going on in the background here is the potential sale of Tottenham to a new ownership. And there's a lot we can't say about it at the moment. My understanding is that if there is a sale, that Daniel Levy will remain in charge. What we don't know at the moment is whether the new ownership will either want to put in someone alongside Daniel or maybe even above Daniel to try and influence some of the day-to-day decisions, or whether they will continue to give Daniel Levy the authority that he's had for 20-odd years with ENIC and carry on running the club how he wants. Because obviously, if a new ownership comes in, more often than not, experience tells you they kind of want their own manager. They tend to want their own guy at the helm. That would be further writing on the wall for Ange Postecoglou. I think if he doesn't win the Europa League, I can't see how he stays in the job. It could come a lot sooner than that. If they get knocked out of that competition, you could argue, is there any point keeping him until the end of the season, given where they are in the league? So it's just another sort of level of uncertainty that will not help Postecoglou as he desperately tries to rescue this season. I think there will be changes at the executive level going forward. We're yet to sort of see exactly how Vinai is going to fit into the structure, but they've got Scott Munn there, who's been doing a lot of the commercial deals, only recently appointed. I think he only went in last summer. You'd have to say, do they necessarily need him if Vinai's going to come in and have that remit? If he's not, then you can see Scott staying. But there are sort of questions to answer there. And the more voices there are wanting to make their impact felt, wanting to stamp their authority on the club, the harder it's going to be for Postecoglou, I think, to keep his job.
Beth, I mean, are you from the outside, do you think that Ange deserves more time, or is it looking like the end? And if it is the end, is there anyone in particular you'd like to see taking that job at Spurs?
Oof, that's a big question. I do feel a little bit sorry for Ange in the sense that, I mean, the injuries that they've had, have just been ridiculous, and you've seen sort of moments this season where his brand of football, you've seen it clearly, you've seen his vision for the team, and when it works, it's fantastic, but it just hasn't worked enough. And I think sort of when you look at how fractious things have become, even with maybe the fans, and I know James, you were at the game, weren't you, when he sort of cupped his ear to the fans, and he obviously came out and he said that he didn't mean it in that way, but it just feels like maybe it just sort of feels like it's a little bit too far gone now for Ange, and I think probably it's best for all parties to maybe cut ties this summer. Obviously, if he wins the Europa League, maybe that's a different thing. But in terms of people coming in to replace him, it's such a hard job, isn't it? I mean, so many people have tried, and they've tried so many different types of managers. They've gone for sort of the tried and trusted in Mourinho, which obviously was a bit of a disaster. Conte as well. I know Iraola is one name that's been touted, and it'd be interesting to see how he fared, with the greatest respect to Bournemouth, at a bigger club, I guess. But ultimately, it sort of feels like Tottenham have ruined managers over the past few years. So I think for people like Iraola, you maybe would be slightly wary of going there at the moment while things are still in flux behind the scenes. But yeah, it certainly sounds like it's going to be a big summer for them.
Yeah, but Beth's right. I mean, the two names that they've discussed internally are Marco Silva at Fulham and Areola at Bournemouth. I think Thomas Frank probably is in that conversation as well. But I think it's Silva and Areola are the two that, if it's Daniel Levy's decision and his alone, I think those are the two names that they would turn to first. But I think, with Postecoglou, the situation really is that for someone who is actually a very effective and open communicator before games, not so much after games, because he can, the whole staring at the floor and not really looking at you and growling and for 3 minutes and being a bit irritated and then walking off. That, a lot of people see that. But I see him for sort of 30, 35 minutes before games when he's open, he takes questions from everywhere, takes them on, answers them at face value. But for somebody who's such a good communicator, he's lost control of the message at Spurs. And that whole thing about, I didn't cut my ears, I just wanted to hear them chant, and cheer because we'd scored a goal, was just a ridiculous attempt to backtrack. It was obvious what he was doing, and it again would be understandable because he's felt under a lot of pressure. He made a substitution that was criticised, and within 5 minutes, the guy he brought on scores. Of course, the goal, sadly for him, is ruled out by VAR, but you can understand why he'd think. An openly emotional man, as he admits himself, would think, actually, I do want to give a bit back here. And I do know what I'm doing, and get behind the team. And I think if he'd sort of owned that and kind of been as honest as he has been in other situations, then I think he could have ridden that out. But by sort of backtracking on it, and then a few days later sort of suggesting there's a mole who's leaking information about the team, it just adds to that sense of the manager not being in control of the first team affairs. And when you combine that with the sort of disgruntlement of the fans, which, by the way, is still mostly aimed at Daniel Levy, it's not actually aimed at Postecoglou. He's kind of turned the guns on himself a bit there when he didn't really need to. And then you factor in the sort of rumours you hear about whether one or two of the players are sort of unhappy with the no-nonsense, never compromise approach of all-out attack and, we go for it, that's who we are, that kind of thing. You put it all together, and it is very difficult to see how he stays on.
Well, James, just end with you then. I mean, Tottenham obviously see themselves as a consistent qualifier for the Champions League. They've clearly got a Champions League stadium, but is the gap between where they are now and where they think they should be, is that as simple as bridged with a new CEO and a new manager, or are the issues just running far deeper than that?
Well, there is this misnomer that Spurs have not spent money in the market. I mean, they have. They spent 60 odd million on Solanke. They spent 40 odd million on Pedro Porro. They've committed significant sums to. I would just pluck two names out of there, but you could throw in Richarlison. You could throw in a lot of names there of where they've committed big money. Romero, Van der Ven on these signings, and not enough of them have worked out. And I don't think the new CEO is going to be in charge of recruitment. He wasn't at Arsenal, and I don't think he will be now. They've had Fabio Paratici, who was obviously involved there. He then had the ban, but from what you hear, he still might be at least providing the advice as far as he can within the rules of the game. You've got Johan Lange, who's also there as a sporting director, who's obviously got his technical director. He's got his own influence over recruitment. That Spurs need to be braver with their recruitment. They need to not just shop in the cheaper end of the market and the younger end of the market, thinking about potential resale value. It was a frustration that several managers have had. Think about Antonio Conte, think about Jose Mourinho, managers who want players ready to win here and now. And I'm not suggesting they go and sign Kevin De Bruyne or a load of sort of 30 plus players who could do it for a year or so, because then you sort of end in a kind of Casemiro situation. But what I'm saying is, they need to balance their recruitment better and not be always thinking about tomorrow. That's the problem with Tottenham. They've always thought about tomorrow. It's sensible financial planning. We build a fantastic stadium for the future. We build a great training ground for the future. We sign young players for the future. But there comes a point where managers want to win now. The fans want to win now. They don't pay their season ticket in a year's time. They pay for it now because they want to watch that team win now. And they need that win now mentality in their recruitment. That's the biggest change they need to make.
Well, it's time for a break, and when we come back, we'll be joined by Ian Darke, who's going to talk us through his picks for Premier League Player of the Season.
Well, something a little different now as we welcome in legendary commentator Ian Darke. Ian, how are you today?
Very well. I'm not sure I can live up to that billing, though.
Oh, you do every single day. Don't you worry about that. Well, you're here with us today to discuss a feature you've got publishing on ESPN.com this week. Your top 10 contenders for the Premier League Player of the Season award. Might as well start at number one, which I think is pretty obvious, but make the case for Mo Salah, please.
I think it's pretty easy. I think he's going to win the Football Writers' Footballer of the Year, which goes back to 1948 when Stanley Matthews won it, and he's going to win the PFA Player of the Year, and deservedly so. I think it was 27 goals and 17 assists in the Premier League alone going into the weekend. Okay, he stopped scoring in the last month, but that happens to anybody. But it's fantastic he signed this new contract because he's in mint condition still. So I think they're going to get another couple of pretty good years out of him. Obviously, he'll start to deteriorate a little, but who would argue realistically that he is the player of this year?
Beth, I'll come to you. I mean, obviously there's a school of thought that Virgil van Dijk is more important than Mohamed Salah in the sense of how much he holds it all together at the back, how important his leadership is. Can you make the argument for Van Dijk over Salah, or is Ian right? Is it Salah all day long?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it is Salah all day long, but I certainly think you can make a case for Virgil van Dijk. I think, as is often the case with these individual accolades, they tend to favour the more attack-minded players, and obviously Salah is the one, I guess, making the tangible difference in terms of chipping in with the goals, and this season, his numbers have been incredible, and not just that, but just his sheer will to win, sort of week in, week out. There have been games where Liverpool haven't been playing particularly well, where he hasn't been playing particularly well, and he's just come up with the sort of the decisive moment. So for me, he is the main man, but Virgil van Dijk is just imperious and almost sort of a victim of his own really high standards, that you just sort of expect him to be pretty flawless every week. And Liverpool have had a little bit of a dip the last month or so, and maybe his levels have dropped slightly as well, but you see yesterday he's involved in a little bit of an error for Liverpool's goal, West Ham's goal rather, against Liverpool at Anfield, and he instantly makes up for it by going to the other end and scoring a great header in front of the Kop. So yeah, Van Dijk for me would be definitely on that list, alongside Ryan Gravenberch, but I think Salah probably just edges it for me.
Rob, no Manchester United players on this list of Ian's. Unbelievable.
Shocking, absolutely shocking.
Gravenberch, Van Dijk, and Salah are all there, as Beth mentioned, those three names. Is it Salah for you?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Beth is right in that all these individual awards, they tend to lean towards the attack-minded players because they catch the eye more than perhaps the defenders. Virgil van Dijk has been fantastic. It would be interesting to hear Arne Slot's opinion, whether he, obviously he would never admit it in a press conference, but if he had to be without one of those two players for a game, I suspect that he may prefer to have Virgil van Dijk in there just because of the stability that he gives that Liverpool defence. But I guess it all just comes down to goals in the end. The hardest thing, players and managers will tell you, the hardest thing to do in football is to score goals. And if you've got someone who's contributing goals and assists, creating, making goals every single week, that guys like that are like gold dust, and that's why the attack-minded players get the big awards, and that's why Mo Salah is probably the best player in the Premier League at the moment.
Ian, I mean, on your list, the closest challenger you had to Mohamed Salah is Alexander Isak. I mean, Rob talks about players in the final third being gold dust. I guess he falls into that category. Why do you think he's the sort of best of the rest?
I think he's had a fantastic season. You look at him and you think he could have been a ballet dancer. He is balletic. His movement and his ability to convert chances, often chances that you don't think are, that much of a chance, like the one he scored at Wembley on Newcastle's big day when they won their first domestic trophy for 70 years. He's just a headache. His speed of thought, his instincts around the box, and he's been superb all season. I hasten to add, by the way, Beth, that Van Dijk is in the list. So too, by the way, is the Nottingham Forest defender Nikola Milenkovic, who is a contender, isn't he, for signing of the season? He's been brilliant at the back there.
He has. He absolutely has. I mean, just on Isak, Beth. I mean, I was at the semi-final, the Carabao Cup semi-final, both legs actually against Arsenal, and rarely have I seen a centre forward do to Gabriel and Saliba what Alexander Isak did that day. I really unsettled them with his movement, with his pace, with his energy, with his intelligence, and ultimately with his finishing. I mean, he's been linked with Liverpool this summer. Do you see that as a genuine target? Do you think they will go for him?
I think there's genuinely admiration there from Liverpool, but I imagine there's admiration there from a lot of top European clubs, and players like him obviously come at a premium. Liverpool, we know, sort of like to be a little bit shrewder sometimes with the transfer business. We saw them not go for Jude Bellingham in the end because the outlay that would have cost allowed them to bring in a couple of players for sort of that same value. So I think moves for players like him, he command well more than 100 million. I think it's 150 million that Newcastle are asking for at the moment. I'm not quite sure they'll get that from anyone, and maybe that's the point. But yeah, I think the thing I will say about Liverpool is that in the past, when they have had one area that they felt they really needed to address and go big, the goalkeeper, centre-back, when they got Virgil van Dijk, they're not afraid to spend big if they feel it's the right man. We saw them bid over 100 million for Moises Caicedo a couple of years back, obviously ultimately ended up going to Chelsea. So I think if there were a genuine possibility of him moving from Newcastle this summer, Liverpool would certainly be interested. But, it is a lot of money. And I'm sure, if Newcastle get Champions League in particular, which it looks like they're on course to do, then they'll be fighting the hardest to keep hold of him.
You can catch Ian's full list when his feature drops later this week, but there are a couple of names in the top 10 I'd like to talk about. Miles Lewis-Skelly being one of them. He's had a tremendous breakthrough season at Arsenal, but there might be one or two critics of you having him as high as 7th. Why have you got him so high? Why do you rate him so highly?
Well, I mean, I hasten to add about this list. It's only my idea, and a lot of people, I'm sure, will have better ideas, and the list might even change between now and the end of the season. But, let's be honest about it. A few months ago, anybody outside Arsenal would not have known this name. Miles Lewis-Skelly. He's suddenly been brought into the team. He's made his England debut. He plays in a game like the Champions League match against Real Madrid and looks totally to the manner born. And to me, you'd have to say at the moment, I mean, things can go wrong for players, injury, they fall out of favour, maybe lose their way a little bit. But at the moment, he looks like he's going to be England's left back for the next decade. He's only 18. I mean, it's been a fantastic breakthrough. I mean, there have been breakthroughs before, that players have had and come onto the scene. But he does look a little bit special.
Rob, just obviously Ian mentioned the England situation there. We've seen Luke Shaw finally reappearing in a matchday squad for Manchester United. Obviously, Gareth Southgate relied heavily on Luke Shaw, took him to the Euros last summer when he clearly wasn't fit, started in the final. Left back, or that left wing back position, if Thomas Tuchel decides to go down that route, has been an issue for England for a while. Do you see, firstly, a way back for Luke Shaw to full fitness and being able to get himself into the England squad? And if not, does Miles Lewis-Skelly have the potential to become England's solution long term in that position?
I mean, it's definitely possible. The interesting thing about Luke Shaw is obviously he's coming back from injury at the moment, but I do wonder whether he's going to get not a lot of opportunities playing at left back at Man United because of the system that Ruben Amorim wants to play. He came on against Newcastle on Sunday for the first time since December, I think, and played in that left-sided centre-half role. And there is a school of thought that maybe Luke Shaw isn't as durable as you need to be to play in as a Premier League fullback. You have to be able to get up and down relentlessly, which is what Miles Lewis-Skelly can do. There is, people who say that, Luke Shaw, because of his injury record, because of his age now, just can't do that consistently in the Premier League. And that if he's going to play regularly at Man United, it is going to be as a centre-back, making those bursts into midfield occasionally, but not being expected to get up and down again and again and again. And if that's the case, and you're picking players on form, as I'm sure that Thomas Tuchel will say, as all international managers say, you'd have to look at that and say, well, if Luke Shaw isn't playing at left-back and Miles Lewis-Skelly is playing at left-back in a fantastic team at Arsenal and performing well week in, week out, then, Miles Lewis-Skelly would have every right to say, well, I should be first choice. I do wonder whether, because of the short-term nature of Thomas Tuchel's appointment, whether maybe you're going to see him revert back to more experience when the big squads are announced for World Cup qualifiers and major tournaments, because, again, he would be well within his rights not to have any kind of plans for England's future, because why would he? He's trying to win a World Cup in 2026, and that's all he's there to do. Obviously, I would like to see young players given a chance at international level regularly, and there is a spot at left back up for grabs. There aren't that many spaces in that England squad, but there is a vacant spot at left back. So it's well within his grasp to make it his regular place, certainly.
Now, we touched on Ryan Gravenberch a bit earlier, but let's just talk about him in a bit more detail. Ian, he wasn't particularly fancied under Jurgen Klopp, and I guess one of the things about Arne Slot, it's often said he's not done that much different to Jurgen Klopp, but maybe the biggest change sort of tactically is to trust Gravenberch, drop him in slightly deeper alongside Alexis McAllister. Do you think he's... I mean, obviously you've got him in this list, so I guess you don't think he's underrated. You're literally rating him, but I mean... Do you think he gets the credit he deserves for the season that he's had?
I think he is starting to get that credit. Everybody's now looking back on what made Liverpool champions this year. And I mean, the story here, the big picture was Liverpool were looking really, I mean, Beth will confirm it, I'm sure, they were looking for somebody to play the number 6 role. As you said, Gravenberch wasn't in favour at all under Jurgen Klopp. In fact, he was starting to look like he might be a bit of a misfit. And suddenly Slot puts him into this role. They don't need a number 6 anymore because they've got this guy who breaks up the opposition attacks and then plays a lot of progressive passing to get Liverpool moving forward quickly as well. So he's not really put too much of a foot wrong so far in that role. So it's a surprise, isn't it? And nobody would have thought last August that Ryan Gravenberch would be in this conversation we're having here, but I think he is.
Beth, do you agree with that? And do you think, in terms of planning going forward, do Liverpool need more cover in that position?
Yeah, I think they do. I think Ryan Gravenberch has played more than double the amount of minutes that he played in the Premier League last season. I actually think by the time the season finishes, it could be close to treble the amount of minutes that he played last season. And he's only 22, which, speaks volumes, I guess, about, first of all, how highly Arne Slot rates him, but also perhaps how little cover he feels he's got in that area. Wataru Endo is a bit of a cult hero at Liverpool, and I would have actually liked to have seen him play a little bit more. I think he's probably better than his little cameos sort of show. I think he's a very good player and was great for Liverpool in the second half of last season. But I don't think necessarily Arne Slot views him on the ball as being sort of a a long-term solution at number 6. So I think that is something that Liverpool in the summer maybe would be smart to address, it is getting someone who can cover and can cover and complement, I guess, Ryan Gravenberch. But yeah, he's been tremendous. I mean, he's only 22. I think he's maybe dropped off again a little bit in keeping with the Liverpool as a whole, I guess, over the past few weeks. But I thought the first half of Liverpool's match against West Ham, he looked very much back to his best, and I don't think it was any coincidence that Liverpool, as a result, looked a lot better when he was sort of firing on all cylinders. And yeah, I think he's just really, obviously Arne Slot has unleashed something in him that maybe previous managers haven't seen. I spoke to his dad earlier in the season, and his dad said he was incredibly grateful to Jurgen Klopp because even though he maybe didn't play as much last season, I think, the family recognised that Liverpool took a bit of a chance on him, bringing him in from Bayern, having not played a lot there. And I think that the preparation that he had last season under Klopp has stood him in good stead for this season. But, his dad also said that they're a family of God-believing people, but they believe that God has sent Arne Slot to Liverpool. That was this other quote that sort of really stuck out to me when I spoke to him, which was really nice. Probably one of my favourite quotes from this season, actually. But yeah, I think that just sort of shows you the impact that Slot has had on players like Gravenberch in terms of allowing them to become, I guess, superstars in this team.
Ian, just finally, because I think we've all had to write pieces like this in the past and just to sort of help you with your social media comments and replies, who are the players who just missed out here? Who are the ones you'd like to give a mention to who didn't quite squeak in the top 10, who, as you say, this ever-changing list might even make it before the end of the season?
I wrote a few names down, actually. There's quite a few names. I don't know whether when the column comes out, they'll be on it. So this is in no particular order. Anthony Robinson, I think the leading defender for assists in the Premier League.
Yep.
Speed merchant. Chris Wood, obviously, the goals at Nottingham Forest. Liam Delap, who scored goals for a team who are going to go down, Ipswich Town. And you've got people like Norgarden and Burnmo and maybe Lewis Potter, who've starred at Damsgaard as well at Brentford. I'd throw Carlos Baleba into the conversation as well here, fantastic player. They're going to make a huge profit on him when they come to sell him. And that's what Brighton do, buy players for relative peanuts and sell them for, profits of 60, 80 million pounds like they did Caicedo. And I think you've got to put Declan Rice in the conversation after those 2 goals he got against Real Madrid, because he rarely plays. I mean, we take him for granted a bit, but he rarely plays a bad game for a team who, after all, look like finishing runners-up. So, yeah, I mean, other people will have a lot of other ideas, but, there's a few.
Well, Ian, it sounds like you've got enough content there for 2 features, but the one that you have written will be on the site. Check it out later this week. Thank you for joining us. And we're going to take a break now. When we come back, we'll be talking about the next step for Kevin De Bruyne. Well, Kevin De Bruyne announced that he'd be ending a decade of incredible success with Manchester City at the end of the season. No doubt the rest of the Premier League will be breathing a huge sigh of relief, but where's he heading next? We're delighted to be joined by ESPN reporter Lizzy Becherano, all the way from the States. Lizzy, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? I'm honoured to be here.
Very good, very good. So no doubt Kevin De Bruyne is a player MLS would love to have playing in the league. What do we know at the moment about the American frontrunners for his signature?
I think you put it perfectly just now. Inter Miami seem to be the American frontrunners, but that by no means exemplifies their interest. So basically what happened recently is we found out through sources that Inter Miami hold De Bruyne's discovery rights, which is a difficult concept to explain because it's unique to Major League Soccer. Essentially, in extremely simple terms, it means dibs. Inter Miami hold the exclusive rights to negotiate with the player because they placed him on their discovery list. Clubs around the league have 5 slots on their discovery list, which means they can have up to 5 players at any given time. San Diego, for an expansion team, they have 7. Different story. But basically, Inter Miami added Kevin De Bruyne to their discovery list. So that means no other team in the league can negotiate with the player. Inter Miami are the only ones right now that can have those types of conversations. Now, does that mean that Inter Miami is going to for sure sign him in the summer or in the winter? Definitely not. It just means they stand as the only team at the moment to be able to negotiate with the player.
I love the idea of just teams worldwide being able to basically call shotgun on who they want to sign. I think we should just scrap the window. That's how we should just do all transfers everywhere going forward. But I mean, Lizzy, do you think look, it's an obvious question. The obvious answer is yes, he's a brilliant player who'd fit into any team. But knowing what you know about Inter Miami and the sort of the balance of the egos there and getting a player with his stature in, would he fit? Is it sort of easy to just say he's a great player, he could play anywhere? How would he fit in if he did go to Inter Miami, do you think?
Yeah, he would definitely fit. I think Javier Mascherano would find a way to make it work, as he has done with a couple players on the roster. I think right now, first and foremost, you have to figure out if logistically, rules-wise, he fits in this roster. Because, again, MLS is quite complicated in that it has a very specific structure to the roster. You can only have 3 designated players, which means they can make above the salary cap. Inter Miami already has those 3 in Jordi Alba, Sergio Busquets, and obviously Leo Messi. So with the idea that De Bruyne wants to make a certain amount of money, he would need to fit into that designated player spot. Now, there are various moves Inter Miami can make in terms of buying down a contract or buying down a player, but it's extremely complicated. So more than if he fits how this team can play or whether he fits the style of Mascherano, it's much more about structurally how Inter Miami would need to reassign these labels to certain players in order to fit him into the system.
Rob, what are you hearing from Kevin De Bruyne's side in Manchester? I mean, we've talked a bit about his situation a few times this season on the podcast, and that he's obviously had a bit of a fractious relationship with Pep Guardiola. He's back fit, playing pretty well, certainly against Palace last weekend. I mean, do you think he sees MLS as his next step? Does he feel, with respect to that league, that he wants to play at a higher level, maybe in Europe before then? I mean, where do you think he sees his game? What are the sort of noises coming out of the players' camp?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a bit of I want to say an odd situation, really, because the end of Kevin De Bruyne's contract was no secret. And there were talks with City at the start of this season, sort of August, September time. Then in September, he gets quite a bad injury. He's ruled out for quite a long time. And De Bruyne himself said that at that time that the talks just stopped because his focus was on his recovery and he was trying to get back in the team. So it wasn't really the right time. And it seems like those talks just never really restarted. Now, since he came back into the City team, he hasn't looked himself. I don't want to say he's run out of legs, but he's getting to that stage where that sort of yard that he had has gone. Pep Guardiola wasn't picking him in some really big games, leaving him on the bench in others. Even when City were in desperate need of a goal, he was leaving him on the bench and not bringing him on, which kind of tells its own story. I mean, the indications from City are that this is City's decision. De Bruyne, people around De Bruyne have kind of hinted that he would have been happy to stay at City for another couple of years on the same contract, so not looking for a pay rise, just to stay on the same wage, which is significant. It's not nothing, but he's not looking for a pay rise, and it was City's choice to move on. There is an interest in MLS. He's attended MLS games in the past. He's got a young family. I think he sees the appeal in raising his family in America because of the standard of living. There's also interest in Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia can offer you an awful lot of money, but perhaps not the same lifestyle as perhaps you can get in California or Florida, for example. I thought it was interesting after the Palace game, though, that he was asked explicitly, are we seeing the end of you in England? And he kind of left the door open a little bit. Now, the fact that he was ready to negotiate with City and kind of wanted to stay suggests that he still thinks he can do it in the Premier League, in the top 5 leagues. So perhaps he's thinking that maybe he does get another move. I would be amazed if it was England, but maybe he gets a move to Spain or somewhere else. And then the move to MLS or to Saudi is still there in 2 or 3 years. Because he is past his 30th birthday, but he's not 38, 39. He has still got time left in his career. I do just wonder whether there is another European move in him somewhere, or perhaps he's using his time to kind of sound out some clubs to see if there is a reasonable offer there. I think if that wasn't there, I think his preference probably would be MLS, simply because of the lifestyle that you can have in the United States over, say, Saudi Arabia. But I think he was being honest when he said after the Palace game that I think he thinks that everything's still open and he's got time now to look at his offers and make the right choice for him and probably most importantly, his family.
Lizzy, can you give us a sense of the level of excitement about the possibility of De Bruyne going to America? I mean, where does it rank? I'm guessing it's not quite Messi levels, but where does it sort of rank? You know, how much excitement is there about this possibility?
There's a lot of excitement. I will say, when Messi joined the league in 2023, it opened up this idea of the stars coming to MLS. And obviously that concept hasn't disappointed. And so fans just see this potential move as another step into the success of MLS. So the idea that it's possible definitely adds to the excitement. If this rumor had been started prior to Messi, I think people would be a little more doubtful rather than excited. But since Messi's here, the idea of adding De Bruyne to the list just makes it even more sensational. Obviously, with the idea that he can either be Messi's teammate at Inter Miami and what that would mean for the team, or having him join another club and having be his rival, and looking forward to kind of that matchup and that face-off. So it's twofold.
Beth, we talked, about Salah and the impact that him staying will have on the rest of the league. What do you think the impact of Kevin De Bruyne leaving the Premier League will have on the rivals, Liverpool, the Arsenals, who've had to put up with him and his fantastic performances for so many years?
Yeah, I think it's probably the reverse of what a number of Premier League fans probably felt when they heard Mo Salah was staying. It was just this sort of sense of relief that they won't have to face Kevin De Bruyne anymore. He's right up there in terms of forget, best Premier League midfielders, best Premier League players of all time, really. It's been such a joy to watch. If there's one player from any team in the world, really, that I could have put into Jurgen Klopp's Liverpool, it would have been Kevin De Bruyne, because I think that the way that he plays, his ability, his vision, is unlike anyone else in the league. And I think, he could massively have elevated what Liverpool did under Jurgen Klopp. So, yeah, I think that there will certainly be relief from Liverpool that they're sort of seeing the back of him. I'm sure Liverpool won't be the only team to feel that way, but what a career he's had. And, it would be nice to see him go on somewhere else. It's been sad, really, to sort of see this season, obviously, that fractious relationship a little bit with Guardiola, and the fact that he's maybe not been playing at his best level. I mean, when Liverpool went to the Etihad earlier this year, it's sort of the least effective I've ever seen him in a game against Liverpool, and that probably speaks to where he's been at this season, not being quite fully fit and at his best. But certainly, he's still got a couple of years, I guess, ahead of him, and it'd be nice to see him playing at a high level and enjoying his football again. Yeah,
I think for me, he's probably the player I've most enjoyed watching, I think, over the last 4 or 5 years, when he was at his peak in that time anyway. People sort of talk about how robotic City have become and whether Guardiola's style of football is too functional, but the artistry with which he plays, he just lights up every stadium he goes to, and the passes that he sees, there's nothing robotic about that. It's just wondrous to watch. And Rob, I just want to finish with you on this. Sort of given his impact, given his status, the legacy that he leaves, I mean, are City looking at Phil Foden to step into that role, or do you think they're going to try and find somebody in the market to replace him moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that this has been City have driven this decision suggests that they've got a plan for the succession. It's not him saying I'm off and leaving City in the lurch. It's City sort of saying, I think it's time for us to move on. Phil Foden is a natural choice. So obviously last season when Kevin De Bruyne wasn't fit regularly, Phil Foden moved into a more central position than perhaps we'd seen him in the past, and was so good that he was named PFA Player of the Year. The slight issue with that is that this season his form, for whatever reason, whether it's tiredness or something else, has dropped off a cliff. And so, Phil Foden really needs to start working on his own form before he starts trying to sort of fill Kevin De Bruyne's boots. I actually think that City may look to try and replace him in the market. I mean, Florian Wirtz is the one that they would love. They've followed him for a number of years. They've had scouts at basically every Bayer Leverkusen game for the last sort of 3 or 4 years. There's going to be an awful lot of competition for his signature, particularly from Bayern Munich, but there's also been links with Real Madrid, although I don't really see where he fits in there. There has been a suggestion from Germany that Wirtz thinks that his next move probably should still be in Germany, and that he's more comfortable perhaps going to Bayern Munich than he is to making a switch to the Premier League and to Man City. But I don't think that'll stop City at least trying in the summer. They've certainly got the money to do it. If he's going to cost more than £100 million, City could do that financially. It's just, I think it's about whether they can convince Wirtz to move to City over Bayern Munich. So that's certainly one to watch. But as I say, just the fact that City have driven this, and it's not De Bruyne sort of saying I'm off. I think City have shown in the past that with all these kind of players, whether it's been David Silva, whether it's been Aguero, there has been a kind of plan in place. Maybe not immediately obvious, but kind of later down the line, it's become clear that they had a plan in place to replace these massive players. And I would expect that they've got the same in mind for De Bruyne. Despite how fantastic he's been and such a central part to what they've done in the last 6 or 7 years, I would always back City to find someone or find a way to move on from these great players.
Well, Kevin De Bruyne is saying goodbye to Manchester City, and we're saying goodbye to you. That'll do us for this week. My thanks to Rob, Beth, Ian and Lizzie. We'll be back next week. Catch you then.